quest for the spirit in the present age. Those of you who attach some value to the form of spiritual science presented in these two lectures will have to consider a strange paradox which has arisen in human evolution. It is that a spiritual stream or impulse may be entirely right for a particular age, if seen from a higher point of view, but will at the same time be sharply rejected by the people of that age, rejected in a way which is also entirely understandable. At the dawn of the present age, the impulse to see the universe in a new way came through Copernicus. It was right for the age insofar as human evolution made it necessary for the impulse to arise exactly at that time. Yet for a long time to come it was also to prove wrong for the age, for it was opposed by all the people who wanted to hold on to old ways of thinking and to prejudices which had persisted for hundreds and thousands of years. Anthroposophy, an approach to life based on spiritual science, seems right for the age to those who believe in it. But there are still many people today who do not see it in that light. I believe, however, that in these two lectures I shall be able to show that at a deeply subconscious level, humanity is longing for anthroposophy today and lives in expectation of it. In the first place, those who are engaged in this science of the spirit see it as a discipline in which the scientific work of recent centuries is genuinely taken forward into the future. It would be utterly wrong to think that it in any way opposes the great triumphs, tremendous advances, and far-seeing truths which natural science has provided. The intention is rather that it shall serve for the exploration of the world of the spirit, just as natural science has served and still does serve for the exploration of the physical world. We might call it the offspring of modern scientific thinking, even if there are many who are inclined to doubt this. To give you an idea, not proof, but an idea intended to help understanding, let me say the following about the relationship between anthroposophy as a science of the spirit and the approach used in natural science. If we consider the tremendous advances made in scientific knowledge over the last 300 or 400 years, we can say that, on the one hand, science has yielded immense insights within the wide horizon of human perception, and on the other hand, the scientific way of thinking has found practical application in everyday life. Wherever we look in technology and commerce, we see the practical application of scientific laws and discoveries. To get an idea of how anthroposophy relates to these scientific advances, let me first of all use an analogy. We may consider a farmer who tills his fields and gathers his harvest. Most of the fruits gathered in the fields enter into the sphere of human life, being used for food, and only a small part is left over. This is used as seed for new crops, and it is the only part of which we may say that the germinating power and the powers which generate life and matter, powers inherent in the sprouting grain, are allowed to take effect. Most of the harvest which has been brought in is not allowed to follow its own inherent laws of growth and progression, but is taken into a side stream, we might say, to provide food for humanity. This is more or less how anthroposophists see the scientific discoveries made in the recent centuries. These have, for the most part, been used, quite rightly, to gain insight into the outer physical world, perceptible to the senses, and have been of practical use to humanity. Some of the ideas which have arisen from study of the natural world in recent centuries may be, in quotes, left over in human souls, however, and not used to understand anything to do with the physical world, build machines, or nurture industries. This remnant is brought to life and allowed to follow its natural destination and laws of development, like grain used for seed. If people really give their minds to the magnificent fruits which science has yielded, and let this insight live in their souls, if they have the kind of feeling which makes them ask, quote, how can the concepts and ideas developed in natural science be used to illuminate and understand the inner life? Can they help us to see where the powers lie that generate the inner life? And if in the light of all that has been achieved, close quote, and if in the light of all that has been achieved, we ask these questions not in a theoretical sense, but out of the fullness of our inner life, something emerges which can become part of human civilization in an age when natural science has been cultivated in its own ground for a time. There is another way in which this science of the spirit may be called the offspring of scientific thinking, even if the methods used to study the spirit have to be different from those used to study the physical world. If we want to have the same kind of properly organized, sound scientific basis for our study of the spirit as for the study of the physical world in natural science, the thinking used in natural science must be transformed to make it an effective tool for our purpose. Something will be said in these lectures of how this may be achieved. Anyone who is firmly grounded in natural science will be qualified to realize that spiritual insights cannot be gained with the methods used by scientists. Inspired minds have said over and over again that we have to realize that our powers of insight are limited if we base ourselves on the safe ground of modern science. Natural science and Kantianism, to mention just these two, have helped to create the belief that human powers of perception are limited, and that it is not possible to penetrate the regions where the source spring is to be found, with which the soul must feel connected, and where we are able to realize that other forces are also involved, and not only the forces which can be understood by scientists. Scientists of the spirit are in full agreement with natural scientists on this point. The powers of perception, which have made natural science great, and to which natural scientists must adhere, do not allow us to enter into the realm of spirit. Yet the human soul has other powers of perception, which lie dormant within it. These cannot be used for the run-of-the-mill activities of ordinary science, but they can be brought out from the underground depths of the human soul, and if this is done, they will change human beings. They give us new powers of perception and understanding, allowing us to penetrate regions which are closed to natural science. Using a term which I do not particularly value, but which does help to clarify the matter, it may be called a kind of, quote, spiritual chemistry, close quote, which allows us to penetrate the spiritual realms of existence. This chemistry is similar to ordinary chemistry, insofar as both use unfailing logic and methodical thinking. In all other respects, it is the chemistry of the inner life of man. Let me use another analogy. When we look at water, this has specific properties. Chemists will tell us it contains hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is a gas which will burn. It is quite different from water. Would anyone who does not know anything about chemistry be able to look at water and see that it contains hydrogen? Water is a liquid. It does not burn, but actually puts out fire. In short, can anyone tell it contains hydrogen by just looking at it? but chemists take hydrogen from water. The water is analogous to ordinary human beings, and the way in which they are perceived in ordinary science. They are a combination of physical matter, life, and an element of soul and spirit. In the light of the philosophy of modern science, ordinary scientists are perfectly right in saying that if one looks at human beings, it is not possible to say that they have an element of soul and spirit in them. It is therefore perfectly understandable if the existence of this element is utterly denied in the light of this philosophy. We might, however, just as well deny the essential nature of hydrogen. We will, of course, have to prove that it is possible to use our chemistry of soul and spirit to show this element of soul and spirit as distinct from the living physical body. This can be done. And the message of Anthroposophy is that there is such a chemistry, in quotes, of soul and spirit, just as the message Copernicanism gave to a greatly surprised world was that the earth does not stand still, but moves at tremendous speed around the sun, whilst the sun is standing still. The works of Copernicus and his followers were on the Index Prohibitorum until the 19th century, and to some extent the insights gained through Anthroposophy will long remain on the, in quotes, index of all the philosophies which for a long time to come will not be able to let go of centuries-old prejudices and habits of thought. And yet, Anthroposophy has been able to enter into human hearts and souls, and is not exactly alien to the needs of our time. We have a small piece of evidence to show that this is so. I do not mean to boast, but it is something worth mentioning as evidence that Anthroposophy is right for our age, even if knowledge of this still lies hidden in people's souls. The fact is that we are now in a position to build an independent school of spiritual science on independent Swiss soil. Thanks to the understanding shown by friends of this movement, we can now see the new round building with its double cupola on the hills of Dornach, near Basel, which is intended to be a first outward sign of what this science of the spirit has to contribute to modern civilization. The building work is in progress, with the two cupolas already visible in outline above the base, and this enables us to speak of Anthroposophy with increased hope and inner satisfaction, despite all opposition and lack of understanding in the world at large. The spiritual chemistry of which I have spoken cannot, of course, be achieved with external methods and techniques visible to the eye. It happens entirely in the human soul, and the work to be done is inner work, in soul and spirit. Such work will not leave the soul as it is in everyday life, but will transform it into a completely new instrument of perception. Spiritual chemistry, in quotes, does not mean any kind of miracle workings nor anything based on superstition, but making inner efforts in soul and spirit, based on powers we actually have and use in everyday life, though perhaps they are only used as a sideline, as it were. These need to be tremendously enhanced. They have to grow infinitely stronger if we are to gain insight into the realm of the spirit. One power, which is used fairly casually in the whole of our inner life and needs to be tremendously enhanced, is the power of attentiveness. What do we mean by attentiveness? Well, it means we do not let life flow past in whatever form it takes. Instead, we pull ourselves together inwardly and direct the eye, EYE, of the spirit to one object or another. We select individual objects, place them in the mind's field of vision, and concentrate our powers of soul on them. It is fair to say that in everyday life, too, our inner life, which needs activity, is only possible because we are able to develop such an interest, lifting individual events facts and creatures out of the stream of life as it flows past. This kind of attentiveness is entirely necessary in everyday life. We shall come to realize more and more, especially when people are taking even a little interest in Anthroposophy, that anything to do with memory, as people call it, is basically simply a matter of paying attention. This will open up important aspects, particularly in education. It would be reasonable to say that the more effort is made to let the soul be actively interested, in the case of children and young people and also in later life, the more will the power of memory be strengthened. On the one hand, this will have a positive effect on the objects to which we have given our attention. And on the other hand, the more we are able to practice this giving of attention, the more will our memory grow in power and intensity. There is something else as well. Everybody has heard of the sad mental condition which we may call, quote, discontinuity of consciousness, close quote. There are people who cannot look back over the whole of their life and know, I myself have had this or that experience. They do not know what they have lived through. It can happen that they leave home having lost the thread of continuity in their inner experience. They leave home for neither rhyme nor reason, walking about like lost souls. And it may be years before they find their own self again and are able to connect with the experiences of their ego. Such things would never end as tragically as they often do if it was known that this integrity of consciousness, maintaining full inner conscious awareness, depends on the regular development of active interest. Active interest, attentiveness, is therefore something we need in everyday life. To be scientists of the spirit, we have to take it as our basis and develop it to strengthen the inner life, deepening it in what we may call meditation and concentration. These are the technical terms for the process. In ordinary life, life itself makes us turn our attention to one thing or another. Scientists of the spirit methodically direct the full powers of soul to an idea, an image, an inner response, will impulse, or particular mood, which are clearly definable and apparent to the soul, and concentrate all their inner powers on them. The method involves suppressing all sensory activity, directed at things outside, which normally happens only when we are in deep sleep. You must subdue all your thinking, all quest for goals, all cares and concerns of life, just as they are subdued in deep sleep. As far as ordinary life is concerned, therefore, you are then exactly as you are in deep sleep, except that you do not lose consciousness, but remain fully awake. All the powers of soul, which are normally scattered over outer experiences and the cares and troubles of life, are concentrated on a single deliberately chosen idea, inner response or the like, which is made the focus of your inner life. With the powers of soul thus concentrated, a faculty which generally lies dormant and only acts between the lines of your present life, as it were, emerges strongly from the human soul. It then actually happens that with attentiveness increased to an immeasurable degree and become highly concentrated and active, the soul learns to experience itself in itself in such a way as to be able to tear itself away from the physical body whilst fully conscious, just as hydrogen is removed from water by chemical methods. It does, of course, take years of inner work to achieve the active attention and concentration needed to enable the spiritual investigator to tear himself away from the physical body. But the time will come when words which sound utterly peculiar to present-day people begin to have meaning for the spiritual investigator. These seemingly fantastic words are, quote, I experience myself as soul and spirit, outside the living physical body, and I know that this body is outside the soul. Well, just as this table is outside my body. I know that when the soul has grown strong, it can have the experience of the body being there before it, like a foreign object. This body and all the destinies it has to go through in ordinary life. Close quote. You, as you normally are, come to be completely outside when you experience yourself as soul and spirit separate from the body. And this soul and spirit entity then has completely different qualities from those it has when it is bound up with the physical body and its senses and uses the brain-bound intellect. The first thing to happen is that the power of thought separates from physical experience. I do not want to talk in abstract terms, but give you real facts. Please do not take it amiss if I use plain words, without prejudice, to speak of things which still sound extremely odd today. When a spiritual investigator begins to find meaning in the words, quote, you are now living in the soul, you know that your soul is a real, non-physical entity in which you find yourself when you are outside your senses and brain, close quote. He first of all feels as if his thinking is now outside the brain, alive and active all around the head. Between birth and death, we must of course always return to the body, and spiritual investigators are able to observe the exact moment when they return to brain-bound thinking after a time when they have been purely in soul and spirit. They find that the brain offers resistance. They feel they come in on waves of an earlier life which was purely in the spirit and slip into the physical brain, which is then active in its usual way, following anything achieved in soul and spirit. To experience yourself out of the body and then entering into the body again is one of the most heart-moving experiences for the spiritual investigator. Thinking which experiences itself purely in itself and takes place outside the brain is different from ordinary thinking. Our ordinary thoughts are like shadows compared with the thoughts which open up like a new world to spiritual investigators when they are out of the body. These thoughts are full of inner images, which is also why we call them imaginations, not because we think them to be mere fantasy, something thought up, but because everything we experience in that condition is truly experienced in images. This kind of imagination means you are really entering into things, with everything you come upon in the world of the spirit presenting itself to the mind's eye in images. In this way, thinking can be separated from the living human body, and spiritual investigators thus find themselves in a world of spiritual entities and events. It is also possible to separate other human powers from the living physical body. When thinking is separated, spiritual investigators first of all experience themselves in their true essential nature as soul and spirit. Perception is, however, entirely different from our ordinary sensory perception, where the objects we perceive are outside us, and we come face to face with them. When we are able to perceive with faculties which are free of the body, the spiritual world opens up around us with the same inevitability as colors and light arise for someone who was born blind and has been given sight through an operation. The experience is that you do not simply come face to face with things and entities in the world of the spirit, but actually enter right into them with your whole being. You then know that you perceive by flowing out into things and entities, and becoming aware of them in the images they create for you to behold. You feel yourself to be in constant activity, and one way of describing the way you come to life in the world of imaginative thoughts would be as a spiritual kind of changing facial expressions. You tear your soul and spirit away from the living body, and this element of soul and spirit is in constant activity, entering into events in the world of the spirit, and imitating the powers which are alive and active in them. Your connection with the spiritual entities is such that we may compare it with being face to face with someone and able to enter into their inner life to such an extent that your own face expresses the joy felt by the other individual. You enter with soul and spirit into the experiences of others and become the expression of those experiences. The essence of things comes to expression in your own spiritual character. You are driven to perceive actively. It is therefore reasonable to say that spiritual research makes completely different demands on the human soul from those made in ordinary research, where you are passive as you take note of things. It demands that the soul must be inwardly active and alive. It must be able to enter into things and entities and itself bring to expression what they present to it. Thus it is possible to use spiritual chemistry to isolate soul and spirit from the living body. It is also possible to do this with another power, one that is normally only used in the body and which may be said to pour into the body. Strange as it may sound, this is the power of speech. When we speak, the situation is as follows. Our thoughts live in us. The brain, which vibrates with our thoughts, has a link with the organs of speech. The brain, which vibrates with our thoughts, has a link with the organs of speech. Muscles are set in motion, and our inner experiences flow out into words and live in our words. We can, and indeed from the point of view of Anthroposophy, must say that when we speak, we pour the things that live in the soul into the organs of the physical body. The power of speech can be isolated from the physical body with its senses by increasing our power of attentiveness, as already described, and adding something more, which is that we increase, again beyond all limits, another faculty we possess, which is the power of devotion. We feel this when we are in a religious mood, when we give our loving devotion to someone or something, dedicate ourselves to strict scientific discipline in the study of objects and laws, and when we are able to leave aside all thought and feeling related to the self. In everyday life, devotion really only runs between the lines. Spiritual investigators have to increase and strengthen it beyond all limits. They must be able to give themselves to the ongoing stream of existence in the way we are generally only given up to it, without in any way contributing to the experience. During deep sleep, when all movement of the limbs ceases, all senses are silent, and we are giving ourselves up entirely, doing nothing ourselves. During sleep, we are of course unconscious. We can, however, resolve to make it an inner exercise that is repeated over and over again to suppress all sensory activity, all movement of our limbs, and take life in the physical body with its senses into the state where it normally only finds itself in deep sleep. We can resolve to stay awake in the process, maintaining the full light of consciousness, and developing the inner feeling of being poured into the ongoing stream of existence, and wanting nothing but what the world wants to do with us. If we can enter into this feeling over and over again, and do so quite separately from the faculty of attentiveness, the soul itself will grow stronger and stronger. It is important to keep the two exercises, attentiveness and devotion, entirely separate, for they conflict. Attentiveness calls for maximum effort and concentration focused on a single object. It is deepened meditation. Devotion calls for giving ourselves passively to the ongoing stream of existence, increasing beyond limits the feeling we know in religious experiences and in loving devotion to someone else. The fruit of such a limitless increase in devotion and attentiveness is the ability to isolate the inner life of the soul from the living physical body. The power which is otherwise poured out into words, a power which acts by not existing in itself and for itself, but setting the nerves in motion, can be isolated from thus coming to expression in speech, and remain in itself in the sphere of soul and spirit. The power of speech is then torn away from its physical and sense-bound context, and we experience what Goethe called, quote, spiritual hearing, close quote. Once again we find ourselves out of the body, but this time we enter into things and perceive their inner nature. We perceive them in such a way as to recreate them within us, as if with an inner gesture. Not merely a facial expression, but an inner gesture. The activity of the soul and spirit element, which has been torn away from the body, is similar to what we do when we are tempted to use a special gift of imitation and express something we have in mind in a gesture. There we merely use a special gift. Now the soul, torn from the body, does the same thing in order to perceive. It enters into things and actively recreates the powers it perceives at work in them. In the world of the spirit, to perceive always means to be active. We perceive the things we enter into by recreating the inner life and activity we find there. In the physical world we are passive when we listen and hear. In our spiritual hearing, speech and hearing seem to become one. We enter into the essential nature of things and hear what lives in them. Pythagoras', quote, music of the spheres, close quote, can be heard by the spiritual investigator. We enter into the objects and entities in the world of the spirit and hear by giving utterance. It is the experience of speaking as you hear and hearing as you speak when you enter into the nature of things. This is true inspiration. A third inner activity and experience may come to spiritual investigators if they continue to develop enhanced attentiveness and devotion when out of the body. Let me present this in the following way. Look at a child. Time will not permit me to go into detail, and I shall limit myself to brief mention of what matters to us today. One of the characteristics of developing human beings is that they must find their own orientation in space during childhood. At birth they are unable to walk or stand, and to begin with they have to move on all fours. They then develop the inner powers which we may call powers of coming upright. And this leads to something, the significance of which has been felt by many deep thinkers, who have said that by being able to come upright into the vertical, human beings are able to look out into the far distances of cosmic space, and their field of vision is not limited to the earth world. The most important thing, however, is that human beings have inner powers and are able to gain in strength and inner experience, thus developing from life in the horizontal, where they are helpless, to life in the vertical, standing upright. Natural scientists will simply have to realize that this inner human activity is very different from the hereditary powers which give animals their orientation in the world. The powers which give animals a particular orientation relative to the vertical act in an entirely different way from the sum of powers which tear human beings away from their position of helplessness. This sum of powers, it is a whole system, a large sum of powers, is inwardly active and gives human beings the orientation in space which makes them earthly human beings in the true sense of the word. The activities of these powers are deeply hidden, and we must have studied a certain amount of spiritual science before we are able to find them. Not all these powers are used up when we learn to walk and talk in childhood. Some still lie dormant in us. But no use is made of them in our ordinary life in the sphere of the senses and in conventional science. Doing the exercises in enhanced attentiveness and devotion, we become inwardly aware that the powers which made us come upright in childhood are still within us. We grow aware of non-physical powers of orientation and of movement. And the result is that, in addition to the inner faculties of giving facial expression and creating gesture, we develop an inner physiognomy of soul and spirit. When the soul and spirit are out of the living body, and spiritual investigators begin to know the meaning of the words, quote, "You now live in the soul and spirit," close quote, the time also comes when they are aware of the powers which made them come upright as physical beings with physical senses on earth. They are then able to use these powers in a new way, giving them a new and different orientation, to take on a new and different form from the human form they had as children. They are now able to develop inner movements, adapt to any orientation in space, and give physiognomies to their spiritual element which differ from the physiognomy it has in the earthbound human being. They are able to enter wholly into other spiritual events and beings, relating to them in such a way that the powers which transform the crawling infant into an upright human being are transformed inside the objects and entities of the spiritual world. They can assume their features and perceive these features by thus bringing them to expression. This is true intuition. Spiritual entities and events are truly perceived by entering into them and assuming their physiognomy. We experience anything which is alive and active in spiritual entities by giving inner facial expression to it. We live in their mobility by recreating their gestures. We assume their actual form by transforming ourselves into them, perceiving them by turning into them. I did not want to use the terms generally used in philosophy to describe the method spiritual investigators use to enter into the world of the spirit in a living way. My intention was to give you a concrete picture, as far as possible, of how the living experience of soul and spirit tears itself away from perception based on the physical senses and enters wholly into the world of the spirit, where perception is based on inner activity. Every step taken into the world of the spirit must involve such inner activity, and we must always know that the things of that world do not offer their essential nature to us, and we can only know about things and events there if we are able to recreate them in active perception. The great difference between perception in the spirit and our ordinary perception in the physical world is that whilst ordinary perception is passive in giving itself up to things, spiritual perception means living in constant activity, so that we actually come to be whatever it is we wish to perceive. People are still prepared, or perhaps again prepared, to forgive us if we speak in general terms of a world of the spirit. But it still sounds very strange in their ears when someone says, quote, "Human beings can leave behind all sensory perception, such as seeing and hearing, and also all thinking that is bound to the nerves and the brain, then when everything we experience in and around us in physical life has vanished, we can know ourselves to be in a completely new, real world, where the entities and events are purely spiritual, just as entities and events are physical here in the physical world. Close quote. What Anthroposophy has to offer is no nebulous pantheism, no hodgepodge kind of life in mind and spirit. Compared with Anthroposophy, to speak of pantheism is rather like saying, quote, I am taking you into a meadow where plants are growing. This is nature, pan-nature, close quote. And then taking people into a laboratory and saying, quote, this is nature, pan-nature. All the flowers and the creeping things, the trees and shrubs, all the chemical and physical processes are pan-nature, close quote. People would be far from satisfied with such a way of presenting nature in the round, for they know very well that the only way they can manage to understand is by considering individual aspects. Rather than a hodgepodge kind of life in mind and spirit, Anthroposophy offers real concrete events and entities, which can be perceived in the world of the spirit. Anthroposophists must not be afraid of challenging the people of their age, but say, here in the physical world, we see physical people around us, who come first in the, in quotes, hierarchy of minerals, plants, animals, and humans. But all this vanishes beyond the horizon of the mind when we come alive in the world of the spirit. Spiritual realms and hierarchies will then emerge, entities which are equal to human beings and others which are higher up in the hierarchy. On earth we have animals, plants, and minerals below human beings in the hierarchy. In the other world, entities and creatures exist at levels above the human level, in higher spheres of being, individual spiritual entities and creatures. In a second lecture, we shall speak of how the human soul has its place in the world of the spirit, and of the life it lives in that world. This is based on the science of the spirit, of which an outline has been given today. We shall also consider the path the human soul has to follow when it has gone through the gate of death and entered a world of pure spirit. The lecture will give various insights into life after death, which have been gained through the science of the spirit. The method developed in Anthroposophy as a science of the spirit is obviously very different from anything people find acceptable, for they live with habits of thought which have evolved through the centuries and are as firmly established as habits of thought people had at the time when Copernicus presented his system of the universe. The question we must face is how the science of the spirit should relate to the quest of the age, if it is to see itself in the right light and have the right attitude to this quest of the age. The first objection, one frequently raised at the present time, is that spiritual scientists speak of developing special powers of soul to enable us to see into the world of the spirit. They feel there is nothing in all this for people who have not developed such powers and are not able to create spiritual images and separate their thinking, powers of speech, and orientation in space from the body. That, of course, is like saying that paintings have nothing to offer to anyone who cannot paint, which would be a sad thing, and that you must have learned how to paint in order to appreciate a picture. But it would be a very sad thing if pictures only meant something to the people who are able to paint them. The fact is that when we see a picture, we have natural powers which enable us to understand it even if we are not able to paint. The human soul has a language which allows it to relate to all art that is alive, and the same holds true in the case of Anthroposophy. You have to be a scientist in this field to discover and describe the facts, events, and entities of the world of the spirit. However, when such a scientist takes care to clothe the things of that world in ordinary thoughts and ideas, and express them in words, which is what I have attempted to do today, anyone can understand them, even without being a scientist. All you have to be able to do is to clear from your mind anything connected with modern education, which presents itself as being firmly grounded in natural science, but which in truth is not grounded in it, but merely believes itself to be so. If you let go of all bias and look without prejudice at the picture presented by the spiritual scientist, the fruits of spiritual science are accessible to everyone. Human souls are made for the truth, and they are sensitive to it. They are not made for untruth and inaccuracies. All it needs is to clear away the debris which has collected because of prejudice. Deep down in the human soul is a secret, intimate language which enables people of all backgrounds, educational and otherwise, to understand the spiritual scientist, if they are willing. This is exactly what scientists of the Spirit see when they consider the quest of our age. In earlier centuries, people were convinced that the only way of knowing anything about the world of the Spirit was to believe. In more recent times, they have been able to think that certain knowledge must always be based on external facts. Today, the situation is that whilst people in general may not yet know it in the upper layers of consciousness, that is, in clear concepts, ideas, and feelings, scientists of the Spirit know quite clearly, quote, "We live in an age when a longing for the science of the Spirit is developing deep down in human souls. It is their true hope." Close quote. People will come to realize more and more that old prejudices must go, especially in our ways of thinking. Today, many people, particularly people who feel they are on solid philosophical ground, are still saying, quote, "Surely Kant has shown, and physiology has shown, that we can know nothing of what lies behind the world we perceive with the senses." And now these scientists of the Spirit want to go against Kant and show that this fact, so clearly established in modern physiology, is wrong. Close quote. Spiritual science has no intention of showing that the statements made by Kant and modern physiologists, from their point of view, are wrong. Yet the people of our age, and those involved in the quest, which is still below the surface in our age, will find that there is a point of view other than calling things right or wrong. Let us see how practical experience in real life looks in relation to this, for it is the most fruitful kind of experience. It would be possible for someone to provide strict proof of the fact that human beings are unable to see cells, for example, with the naked eye. This person might be entirely correct, just as it would be correct to say that with the human faculties known to Kant, it is not possible to enter into the essential nature of things. Let us assume the microscope has not been invented, and it has been proved that people cannot see the smallest particles. This would be correct. The proof would really work in every respect, and there could be no objection to the strict proof that the human eye cannot see the smallest partial organisms which make up large organisms. The issue becomes immaterial, however, with the advance of science. What mattered was that irrespective of the proven facts, physical instruments could be developed, the microscope, the telescope, and all the rest, in order to achieve what demonstrably could not be achieved when human faculties were used unaided. People are right when they say human faculties are limited. Spiritual science does not contradict them. It merely shows that human powers of perception can be enhanced and strengthened in the spirit, just as it is possible to increase our physical powers. It may be absolutely right to hold the opposite view, but spiritual science must be beyond this kind of right and wrong. One day people will no longer insist on everything being proved with the limited powers of proof at our disposal. They will realize that life demands quite different things from human evolution than the logical certainties on which people like to depend. Something else has to be said if the true, and not just the imagined, quest of our age is to be seen in connection with the true goal and purpose of spiritual science. Let me again refer to the truly enormous advances made in natural science. In the light of these, it is not surprising that people think they can build a whole world on the solid ground of modern science, though this does not take account of the powers of which we have spoken today. Materialistic thinking is already widespread today. It calls itself by the somewhat more elegant name monism, because materialistic does not sound so good. The head of this monistic stream is Ernst Haeckel, a man of considerable reputation in his field of natural science, and its lieutenant general is Wilhelm Ostwald. With monism, the idea is to create a philosophy by developing the insights which can be gained from natural science only. People who take up the quest of our age will come to realize that natural science is on solid ground for as long as it limits itself to studying the laws and principles of the physical world. And it has achieved great things. One of its great achievements is that it has swept away old prejudices. Faust still used an outer physical form of magic in his dealings with the natural world. Anyone who understands modern science can no longer use such magic. It is quite another thing that the life of the spirit itself creates an inner magic of the soul by the means I have described. Modern science has done great things in overcoming superstition and doing away with methods of explaining the natural world in the way one would, in quotes, explain a watch by saying, quote, "There are hobgoblins in there," close quote. It has done great things in overcoming a way of looking at nature which wants to have all kinds of ghosts behind the phenomena of the physical world. Its great achievements have been in negation, also as a philosophy. Take a good look at scientific naturalism and how it functions when it is a matter of getting rid of old unhealthy notions of all kinds of invented fantasy figures behind the world of nature. For as long as this kind of thinking exists and has to be opposed, natural philosophy finds a reason for existence in fighting the things which have to be fought. In a sense, however, this fight has had its day. It has done the good it can do. Today, the quest of our age is to ask, quote, "What means can we use to build an image of the world which has room for the human soul?" Close quote. And this is where natural philosophy and Haeckel's and Ostwald's materialism fail us completely, if human beings perceive themselves to be what they really are. Those who take up the quest of our age will come to understand more and more clearly that the people who hold purely materialistic views make excellent soldiers to fight old superstitions. Now, however, they are old warriors who have done their duty but lack the ability to develop the arts of peace, develop industries, and till the fields. It cannot be denied that natural science is outstanding as a philosophy when it is a matter of fighting superstition. For as long as the people who make it their philosophy can go on fighting, this fight means something to their souls and keeps them going. Yet when they then want to create a real image of the world in which there is room for the human soul, they are like old warriors who have no talent for the arts of peace. They then have to face the question in their souls in peacetime, as it were, and they do not arrive at an image of the world. A mood like this will grow in human souls as time goes on. The spiritual investigator is already able to perceive such moods in the depths of those souls. They may not be aware of it, but people are longing for the fruits of spiritual science. This is the secret of the present age. From a higher point of view, therefore, spiritual science is entirely right for our age. Yet for many people who are not yet able to look deep down and perceive what it is they really want, it is wrong for our age. It therefore seems to them that the image of the world presented in spiritual science has no solid scientific foundation. The image of the world presented by monism is thought to be firmly based on the science of the physical world. Looking at the opposite side of the coin, we may say what must happen if the soul truly wants to see its hopes and longings fulfilled. The activity demanded in spiritual science gives something to the soul which really lifts it up to communion in the Spirit, so that we are able to use active perception and gain insight into the spiritual world in its activity. Spiritual science enables us to know the reality of the true world of the Spirit. Monism has nothing to say about this for the people who take up the quest of our age. The quest of our age, the search in which human souls are engaged, cannot be suppressed, however. The result is that some people have got into the habit of directing their inner thoughts, relating to things of the Spirit, in such a way that their thinking is like that of natural science, looking passively at the world outside them. Basically, the situation is that some people, anyone who has been considering this will know about it, want to look at the things of the Spirit in the way one looks at the physical world. I am not saying this will not lead to the truth in some cases, but the method is different from the one used in spiritual science. Spiritualism, or Spiritism, is a school of thought where people want to see spiritual entities and events by looking at them passively from outside, in the way we look at events in the physical world. They do not wish to become inwardly active in perception and rise into the worlds of the Spirit. Where does this Spiritism, which may fairly be said to be materialistic, spring from? It springs from the philosophical approach represented by monism, and holds to the superstition of materialism, to the belief that everything is governed by laws of nature. Some will say they find it hard to believe that Spiritism is actually supposed to be the child of Haeckel's monism. People who follow the quest of our age will find that much the same thing happens with this child as with all offspring. Fathers and mothers often have marvelous ideas as to what their child will be like, and yet as often as not the child will turn into a real brat. What matters is not the civilized child that is the dream of monism, but what the child actually turns out to be. Utter belief in the material world will generate the belief that the spirits too can only act in material ways and reveal themselves in material form. If purely monistic materialism were to grow, Spiritist associations and Spiritist views would grow and flourish to the same degree, creating the necessary counter-image. The more the people who blindly follow the way shown by Haeckel and Ostwald manage to suppress a true science of the Spirit, the more will they find that they are breeding Spiritism, which is the other side of the coin when it comes to a true science of the Spirit. Spiritual scientists who are firmly based on a life of the Spirit, which can be explored, perceived, and known, will be quite unable to follow a method where one seeks to materialize the Spirit and give oneself up to it passively, for the Spirit can only be known through inner activity. I am now going to consider another aspect of this quest of our age, which is as yet unable to understand itself inwardly. A philosopher who deserves our esteem has published a strange essay in a widely read journal. Among other things, he says that many people find Spinoza and Kant quite difficult to read, They get easier as you go on, but their concepts are always shifting and changing. Well, it cannot be denied that this holds true for many people. The author of the essay gives some advice, however, on how it may be done differently and in accord with the quest of our age. According to him, technology now provides us with the means of getting a good picture of the confusing abstract ideas presented by Kant and Spinoza. He wants to use a kind of cinematography to show Spinoza sitting and grinding glass as the idea of extension comes to him. This is to be shown in a sequence of changing images. The image of extension will then be transformed into the image of thinking, and so on. Cinematography could thus be used to create a visual image of Spinoza's whole ethics and philosophy, and this would satisfy those who follow the quest of our age. Oddly enough, the editor of the journal even commented that an invention which may seem no more than a toy to some people, could therefore meet an ancient human need in a way which is entirely in accord with our age. Now, it may be possible in some respects to satisfy the questing minds of our time, though only with regard to outer things, by presenting Spinoza's title Ethics, or Kant's title Critique of Pure Reason, cinematographically. Why not? It would be in line with the passive attitude so popular today. It is so popular that people find it hard to believe that the reality of the things of the Spirit can only be found by going through everything yourself. Our age does not yet accept an approach where you bring the essential nature of these things to expression in your own inner life. Imagine you are standing by a notice board and trying to read the minds of the people who are looking at it. An advertised lecture where no slides are shown and the audience are expected to share in the effort of generating the thoughts presented by the speaker will have a smaller audience than one where it says slides will be shown to illustrate the subject, which means that people will be allowed to be entirely passive. Anyone who looks more deeply into the quest of our age and to its deepest, as yet unconscious, longings and hopes, will find that the impulse to be active, to find oneself again as a soul in full inner activity, is to be found deep down in human souls. Our inner life can only be independent and have moral security if we are inwardly active. It can only have a proper orientation in life if we become aware that we are more than the things we receive passively from the world. For we are also involved in anything we are able to experience through being active. When it comes to the world of the Spirit, human souls can only gain insight into whatever they are able to make their own by being active. If we think the things through which we are given in spiritual science, the effort to grasp them makes us share in the activity. And that is why spiritual science can satisfy the deepest subconscious impulses in human souls today, and help the quest of our age that lies deep down in human souls. We are in a period of transition where these things are concerned. It is, of course, easy to say such commonplace words as, quote, "we are in a period of transition," close quote. All times are times of transition. If we do speak of a period of transition, it is important to say in which respect we are in transition. To describe the transition occurring in our age, we have to say that it has been necessary for humanity to undergo training in passivity, for this was the only way in which the sciences, with everything that has made them great, could achieve their great advances. It was necessary for people to give themselves entirely to the truths of the material world, so that what had to be achieved could be achieved, especially in the sciences. Life, however, goes in rhythms. Just as a pendulum swings one way and then the other, so the human soul, having been rightly trained in faithful, passive devotion, must gather itself up again and become active, in order to find itself in itself. As to what has become of the soul because of its passivity, I am now going to use words that will sound utterly radical, but I will not fight shy of saying them, even if they sound extremely odd to many people. On the other hand, it is exactly when you enter fully into spiritual science that you realize that not to make such a radical statement actually means you are not prepared to face the consequences of the natural scientific approach. It means you do not have the courage to draw the inevitable conclusions. The people who insist they base themselves wholly and entirely on the findings of natural science also do not have the courage. If we were consistent in this, we would hear a murmur of strange words going through the quest of our age. At the beginning of the Old Testament, we have the words, "I shall not go into their inner meaning today." People may take these words in whichever way they can. Some may take them to present an image, others for fact, but everyone will agree with what I have to say about them today. Quote, "And you will be like God himself, knowing or distinguishing both good and evil." Close quote. These are the words which have come down to us with the Old Testament, and whichever way you take them, you will have to admit they hold great significance for human nature and the human soul. The story tells of the tempter approaching the human being and murmuring in his ear, quote, "If you follow me, you will be like a god, able to tell the difference between good and evil." Close quote. You can sense that the inclination toward things other than good would not have arisen in human beings if it had not been for this temptation. Without it, humanity would be inclined only toward the good. The whole of human freedom, therefore, has to do with what is said in these words. It is said that human beings were invited by the tempter to go beyond themselves and see themselves as something they are not, to be like a god with regard to good and evil. As I said, you may think about this in any way you like, and I really do not ask anyone to take the tempter to be a real entity, though for anyone who is able to see through these things, it is quite true that, quote, "They never dream the devil is about, not even if he has them by the collar." Close quote. Anyone who is even a little bit able to listen to the quest of our age will hear his murmurings again, for he is approaching. Call it the inner voice or whatever. We can say that he is here, and this is no superstition. For people who have the courage to draw the final conclusion of a philosophy of life based entirely on natural science, he has highly characteristic things to say, a strange wisdom. The problem is that the people who claim to base themselves entirely on natural science do not have the courage to draw the final conclusion. In their hearts and minds they still believe in good and evil, though they ought to deny the existence of such things when basing themselves purely on natural science. As soon as we base ourselves purely on natural science, it surely is true that not only does the sun shine on good and evil alike, but the laws of nature are such that our human nature makes us do evil just as much as good. The tempter has drawn this final conclusion and murmurs in human ears, quote, "Do you not see? You're simply more highly developed animals. You are like the animals and cannot tell good from evil." Close quote. Our time is a period of transition insofar as the tempter now says the opposite of what we are told he said in the Old Testament. He says, quote, "You are only more highly developed animals, and if you see yourselves as you really are, you cannot say there is a difference between good and evil." Close quote. If people had the courage to draw this conclusion, it would be the outcome of a philosophy which is entirely passive. It is the aim and purpose of Anthroposophy to save our age from this voice, speaking metaphorically, and bring knowledge of life in the Spirit into the quest of our age. People who continue to oppose this science of the Spirit in the light of some other science will have to realize that their opposition is like the original opposition to Copernicanism. Now that we are building our own independent school of spiritual science, we have come to the attention of a world which did not take much notice of us before, with the result that opposition is increasing. In a recent article, I pointed out how today's opponents of spiritual science are taking the same attitude as those who opposed Copernicus. Someone who felt, quite rightly, that this was directed at him, said in reply that Copernicus presented facts, whilst spiritual science was merely making assertions. The poor man did not realize that at one time the facts presented by Copernicus also were mere assertions, and empty of meaning for people like him. He fails to appreciate that what he calls mere assertions are facts in the light of a true science, though of course they are facts relating to the life of the spirit. Both scientists and religious people are, therefore, raising objections to this science of the spirit. In Copernicus's day, people said, quote, "We cannot believe that the earth moves around the sun, for the Bible does not say so." Close quote. Today people say, quote, "We cannot believe what spiritual science tells us, for the Bible does not say so." Close quote. Nevertheless, people will come to accept what spiritual science has to say, just as they have come to accept what Copernicus had to say. It is important always to remember the words of a profoundly learned man who was also a priest. He taught at Basel University, and in his inaugural lecture as Vice-Chancellor, which was on Galileo, said the beautiful words, quote, "In those days people opposed Galileo because they believed he was upsetting the tenets of religion. Today anyone who is truly religious knows that every new truth discovered adds something to the original revelation of divine guidance and the glory and majesty of the divine plan." Close quote. It would be good to draw the attention of our opponents to something which might well have been, though it did not actually happen. Imagine someone had gone to Columbus and said, quote, "We cannot allow you to discover the new continent," close quote, which he then did discover, quote, "for life is fine as it is in the old world, with the sun shining on it all. How do we know the sun will also shine on any new countries which may be discovered?" Close quote. This is how the spiritual scientist sees his religious ideas opposed by people who feel that the discoveries of spiritual science threaten their religious ideas. It must be a feeble faith, a religion built on shaky ground, if people think the sun of their religious feeling will not also shine in any new territory which is discovered in the realm of the spirit. Just as the sun which shines in the old world also shines in the new world. People who consider the facts in an unbiased way can convince themselves of the truth of this. If, in its quest, our age can come to accept spiritual science more and more, it will be touched by it in a way undreamt of by many. Spiritual science still has many opponents, which is understandable. It does, however, make us feel kinship with all the people who, if they have not yet found spiritual science, do have an inkling of the soul's connection with the realms of the spirit, to which spiritual science gives access. With regard to what has been said about the words which the tempter is murmuring today, we feel in harmony, for instance, with Schiller, who did have an inkling of those realms. Schiller did his own research in natural science, and gained the impression that man must be seen as above mere animal existence, and that the human soul has a share in the realm of the spirit. Taking our stand on spiritual science, we feel in deep accord with one of the leading lights in the philosophy of life, which has been evolving in recent times, when we are able to epitomize what has been presented on a broader scale today in the feeling that was put in a nutshell in Schiller's words, quote, "Down came the barrier of animalic dumbness, and human nature shone from brow thus cleared. Thought now came, a noble stranger, sprung from brain surprised. Close quote. Spiritual science confirms that animal nature has been left behind, and human beings now belong to a realm of spirit. This is how it stands with regard to the quest of our age. Finally, let me remind you of someone who lived and worked here in Austria, and whose soul, with great inwardness, dimly felt what has now become certainty in spiritual science. He stood all alone in his thinking and vision, holding fast to a spiritual point of view, despite the fact that as a physician he could base himself fully on natural science. Let us take the words of Baron Ernst von Feuchtersleben, for they reveal something of the highest power the soul can find in itself, once it has the certainty of being connected with the world of the spirit. Ernst von Feuchtersleben, his words may be taken as a motto for everything connected with spiritual science. Quote, "The human soul knows full well that in the final instance true happiness can only be gained by adding to its inner qualities and possessions." Close quote. Adding to our inmost nature, gaining certainty and assurance in it. This is what the science of the Spirit wants to offer to those who are engaged in the quest of our age.